Space Shuttle Challenger. Liftoff from a freezing cold Florida to the cheers of the young students of the first ever U.S. teacher astronaut. Moments later, a massive explosion.
On the morning of January 28, 1986, millions of people watched the Space Shuttle Challenger climb into a cloudless Florida sky. But then, just 73.124 seconds after liftoff, it vanished in a massive white fireball before the eyes of the entire nation. For decades, most people believed they had witnessed the entire tragedy unfold in real time. That the shuttle exploded, the crew died instantly, and the story ended there. But almost every part of that belief is wrong. So, what actually went wrong that fateful day, and what happened to the bodies of the Challenger disaster crew? Before we answer this, let's rewind to the night before, the night that gave birth to this tragedy. One fateful decision, 7 lives claimed. The night NASA chose to launch. Before Challenger ever left the ground, the disaster had already begun to unfold. Not in the skies above Florida, but in a conference room. By the time the countdown reached 0 on the morning of January 28, 1986, the physical failure that destroyed the Space Shuttle Challenger had not yet happened, but the organizational failure almost certainly had. Years later, Nobel Prize-winning physicist Richard Feynman, a member of the Presidential Rogers Commission investigating the accident, would reflect on the incident. For a successful technology, reality must take precedence over public relations, for nature cannot be fooled. You see, there had been warnings. They were heard, debated, and then ultimately ignored. Florida is not a place people associate with freezing weather, yet the night before Challenger's launch became one of the coldest ever experienced during the Space Shuttle program. Temperatures around Kennedy Space Center plunged to approximately 36 degrees Fahrenheit, or about 2 degrees Celsius, before dawn. Ice coated the launch pad, clung to the service tower, and formed long icicles hanging from steel structures surrounding the shuttle. Engineers inspecting the pad found frozen pipes and frost-covered equipment. NASA had never launched a shuttle under such conditions. There were serious concerns about whether every component of the spacecraft would function as designed. Most attention focused on a seemingly insignificant piece of rubber hidden deep inside the solid rocket boosters, the O-rings. Those rubber O-rings were never designed or certified for temperatures that low. Their job sounded simple, but was absolutely critical. You see, each booster consisted of several large segments joined together, and every joint relied on 2 circular rubber seals to prevent superheated gases reaching nearly 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit from escaping. In warmer weather, the rubber compressed quickly enough to seal microscopic gaps created as the booster pressurized during ignition. In extreme cold, however, engineers feared the rubber would stiffen, delaying the seal by fractions of a second. That tiny delay could allow flames to escape. It was a frightening possibility because the boosters carried more than 1 million pounds of solid propellant each. Even more alarming was the fact that this was not an unknown problem. Years before Challenger, several shuttle missions had already experienced partial O-ring failures. Engineers documented erosion, scorching, and something called blow-by, where hot combustion gases slipped past the primary seal before it fully seated. Flight after flight, inspections revealed damage that should never have occurred, yet each mission landed safely. Instead of treating these incidents as increasingly urgent warnings, NASA gradually came to accept them as evidence that the system possessed enough safety margin. Sociologist Diane Vaughan would later coin the phrase normalization of deviance to describe exactly what had happened. When repeated abnormal events produce no immediate catastrophe, organizations slowly redefine those abnormalities as acceptable. Pressure was building from more than just engineering concerns. Challenger had already suffered 6 separate launch delays caused by weather, technical problems, scheduling conflicts, and previous mission overruns. Every postponement created new logistical headaches. The mission also carried unprecedented public attention because schoolteacher Krista McAuliffe had been selected from more than 11,000 applicants to become the first participant in NASA's Teacher in Space project. Television networks had rearranged programming schedules. Schools across the United States planned live classroom broadcasts. Politicians expected another demonstration of American technological leadership. All of this meant that delaying the mission once again became increasingly difficult. As the evening wore on, engineers from Morton Thiokol, the company responsible for manufacturing the solid rocket boosters, became increasingly alarmed. During a tense teleconference with NASA officials on the night of January 27th, several Thiokol engineers, led by Roger Boisjoli and Arnie Thompson, argued that launching in such cold temperatures carried unacceptable risks. Based on existing test data, they recommended not launching below approximately 53 degrees Fahrenheit. Challenger's forecast temperature sat dramatically below that threshold. Boisjoli warned there was no evidence proving the O-rings would function safely in the expected conditions. Just as importantly, there was no evidence proving they would fail. Then the meeting took an extraordinary turn. NASA managers asked for hard evidence that the launch would fail rather than evidence that it might. After a private management discussion away from the engineers, Morton Thiokol executives reversed their own technical team's recommendation and approved the launch. Years later, members of the Rogers Commission concluded that management had allowed the burden of proof to shift in a dangerous direction. Instead of requiring evidence that the shuttle was safe to fly, they effectively required engineers to prove it was unsafe, a standard almost impossible to meet, without first suffering a catastrophe. Richard Feynman would later demonstrate the problem before television cameras by placing a sample of O-ring rubber into a glass of ice water. Seconds later, he squeezed it with a clamp, showing how slowly the chilled material returned to its original shape. It was a remarkably simple experiment, yet it vividly illustrated the very concern engineers had tried to communicate the night before. As dawn broke over Cape Canaveral, crews chipped ice from the launch pad, while final inspections continued beneath a cloudless blue sky. Families gathered in viewing areas. Millions of schoolchildren waited beside television sets. Engineers carried private doubts. Managers reassured themselves that previous launches with damaged O-rings had survived. At 11:38 in the morning, the countdown reached 0. The solid rocket boosters ignited. Challenger rose into the air. What actually happened during those 73 seconds? The first sign that something was wrong appeared so quickly that almost nobody noticed it. It happened less than a second after liftoff. At exactly 0.678 seconds, a high-speed camera captured several tiny puffs of black smoke escaping from the aft field joint of Challenger's right solid rocket booster. They lasted only fractions of a second before disappearing into the exhaust plume. To spectators, the launch looked flawless. But years later, after investigators painstakingly analyzed every frame of film, those wisps of smoke were found to be the first visible evidence that the disaster had begun almost before Challenger had even cleared the launch pad. The source of the smoke was a pair of rubber O-rings buried deep inside the booster joint. The freezing overnight temperatures had stiffened the rubber, preventing it from sealing instantly when the booster pressurized at ignition. For a brief moment, combustion gases heated to nearly 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit escaped through a microscopic gap. Ironically, Challenger was given a temporary reprieve by the very fire that threatened to destroy it. Molten aluminum oxide, a byproduct of the solid rocket propellant, mixed with soot and combustion debris to plug the opening. The leak stopped, at least temporarily. To mission control, every instrument continued reporting a healthy spacecraft. Challenger rolled onto its planned heading, accelerated smoothly over the Atlantic, and climbed into the bright Florida sky as if nothing had happened. For nearly a minute, the shuttle performed almost perfectly. Commander Dick Scobie acknowledged routine calls from Mission Control while pilot Michael Smith monitored the vehicle's systems. Thousands of sensors streamed data to Houston, and nothing suggested catastrophe. Beneath that calm exterior, however, the damaged joint was being subjected to forces it had never experienced before. As Challenger accelerated, it entered a period known as Max Q, the point of maximum aerodynamic pressure. This is the moment when increasing speed combines with the thick lower atmosphere to place the greatest stress on the vehicle's structure. Every launch is designed to throttle the main engines down during Max Q to reduce those loads. But even with reduced thrust, the stresses remained enormous. Then came another factor that investigators would later identify as critical: the weather high above Florida. While the launch pad had been bitterly cold, the atmosphere also contained unusually strong upper-level winds. Challenger encountered one of the most severe wind shear environments of the entire shuttle program. To stay on course, the guidance computer commanded a series of rapid steering corrections, causing the orbiter and its massive boosters to flex and twist slightly under changing aerodynamic loads. These movements were well within the shuttle's design limits, but they were enough to disturb the fragile aluminum oxide plug that had been sealing the damaged joint. At approximately 58 seconds into the mission, cameras captured the first unmistakable evidence that Challenger was in mortal danger. A bright plume of flame erupted from the side of the right solid rocket booster. At first, it appeared almost delicate, a narrow jet no more than a few feet long. But this was no ordinary flame. It was a blowtorch of superheated gases traveling at tremendous velocity, pointed directly toward the shuttle's enormous external tank. That rust-colored tank contained nearly 2 million pounds of liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen, propellants cooled to hundreds of degrees below zero. The escaping flame also struck one of the massive steel struts connecting the booster to the tank. Every fraction of a second, the flame carved deeper into the shuttle's most vulnerable structure. The steel attachment strut began weakening, while the hydrogen tank's lower section suffered increasing damage. Hydrogen started leaking from the tank. But Mission Control remained unaware. As Challenger climbed past approximately 46,000 feet, the weakened booster pivoted inward after the attachment failed. That movement allowed the burning rocket plume to punch directly into the side of the external tank. Within moments, the tank lost its structural integrity. Liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen escaped almost simultaneously, creating an immense cloud of vapor that ignited in the surrounding fire. To millions watching below, it appeared as though the shuttle had exploded. Well, technically, there had been no detonation. The vehicle was simply no longer capable of holding itself together. The last clearly intelligible words came from pilot Michael Smith, who quietly said, "Uh-oh." Seconds later, radio transmissions ceased forever. The orbiter itself never exploded into tiny fragments. Instead, it was ripped apart by aerodynamic forces. The wings separated, the engines tore free, thousands of pieces scattered across the Atlantic. But the reinforced crew cabin at the nose of the spacecraft held firm. Still attached to its forward structure, it broke away largely intact. Carried upward by momentum, it continued climbing. Even after the rest of Challenger had disintegrated, eventually reaching an altitude of nearly 65,000 feet. And then it came crashing down. No engines, no parachutes, no escape. Nearly 3 minutes. Nobody saw. For almost 3 minutes after Challenger disappeared from the sky, the 7 astronauts were still inside the crew cabin, and they were alive. The explosion that audiences saw was primarily the external tank rupturing, while the reinforced crew compartment at the front of the orbiter separated largely intact. Hidden inside that battered capsule were Commander Dick Scobie, pilot Michael Smith, mission specialists Judith Resnick, Ellison Onizuka, Ronald McNair, payload specialist Gregory Jarvis, and teacher in space Krista McAuliffe. After separating from the rest of the spacecraft, the crew compartment continued rising for roughly 25 seconds, eventually reaching an altitude of approximately 65,000 feet, almost twice the cruising altitude of a commercial airliner. Only after exhausting that upward momentum did gravity begin pulling the cabin back toward the Atlantic Ocean. The descent lasted approximately 2 minutes and 45 seconds. The cabin was no longer powered, nor was it attached to the rest of the shuttle. Instead, it entered a ballistic freefall. In freefall, gravity accelerates everything equally, meaning objects inside the cabin would not feel their own weight. Contrary to popular imagination, astronauts do not float because there is no gravity in space. They float because both they and their spacecraft are constantly falling together around Earth. Challenger's crew cabin briefly recreated that same condition. The tragic irony is impossible to ignore. What happened inside the cabin during those final minutes remains one of the greatest unanswered questions of the disaster. You see, we just don't know. NASA's investigators could neither prove nor disprove whether the cabin remained pressurized because the impact destroyed much of the evidence needed to reconstruct its condition. However, they did uncover compelling signs that at least some crew members survived the initial breakup. 3 of the 4 recovered personal egress air packs, or PEAPs, which are emergency breathing air devices, not oxygen tanks, had been manually activated, meaning someone consciously reached over and switched them on after the shuttle disintegrated. Investigators also found several cockpit switches had been moved, suggesting an attempt to restore electrical power or respond to the emergency. Even so, NASA stressed that the evidence could not determine who remained conscious for how long or what they experienced during the cabin's nearly 3-minute fall. The descent ended when the crew compartment struck the Atlantic Ocean at roughly 207 miles per hour. The impact was unsurvivable. The search for the bodies of the Challenger disaster crew. Within minutes of Challenger's breakup on January 28, 1986, NASA, the United States Coast Guard, the United States Navy, and local emergency agencies launched a desperate search and rescue mission with helicopters, aircraft, and ships racing toward the expanding debris field in the Atlantic. The floating wreckage quickly confirmed that there could be no survivors. The mission then shifted into one of the largest underwater recovery operations in American history, covering roughly 480 square nautical miles. Using sonar, search grids, ships, and hundreds of Navy divers working in dangerous, low-visibility conditions, investigators scanned the vast area for any clues. The breakthrough came on March 7, 1986, more than 5 weeks after the disaster. Sonar operators detected a large object resting approximately 18 miles northeast of Cape Canaveral in about 100 feet of water. Navy divers descended through the cold, murky Atlantic and confirmed what many had both hoped and feared to find: Challenger's crew cabin. Although heavily damaged by the impact with the ocean, the reinforced structure remained recognizable. Inside were the remains of all 7 astronauts. NASA then created a secure exclusion zone around the recovery site, keeping media helicopters and unauthorized vessels at a distance. Divers recovered the astronauts out of public view, and every transfer was conducted under strict security. The families were notified before detailed information reached the press. Over the years, some people interpreted NASA's refusal to release graphic photographs or complete medical findings as evidence of a cover-up. The official record tells a far different story. The agency deliberately limited public disclosure to preserve the dignity of the astronauts and spare their families from seeing deeply personal details transformed into public spectacle. The identification process relied on specialists from the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology, forensic experts, and military medical personnel. Dental and medical records, skeletal analysis, and other forensic techniques were used to positively identify every astronaut. Their remains were then respectfully returned to their families for private funerals and memorial services. Just 3 days after the disaster, on January 31, 1986, the nation paused as President Ronald Reagan led a televised memorial service at Lyndon B. Johnson Space Center. Speaking before grieving families, fellow astronauts, and NASA employees, Reagan delivered what many historians consider one of the greatest presidential speeches ever given. He reminded Americans that exploration has always demanded courage, then closed with words that have become inseparable from Challenger's legacy. "We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them." As they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye and slipped the surly bonds of Earth to touch the face of God. There was no single state funeral for the fallen heroes. Instead, each family chose private funeral or memorial arrangements according to their own wishes. Commander Dick Scobie, pilot Michael Smith, and mission specialist Judith Resnick were laid to rest at Arlington National Cemetery. Mission specialist Ellison Onizuka was buried at National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific, while Ronald McNair was buried in his hometown of Lake City. Gregory Jarvis was buried in New York following private services, and Krista McAuliffe was laid to rest in her hometown of Concord. But one question still remained. Why had Challenger been allowed to launch at all? Within hours of the disaster on January 28, 1986, President Ronald Reagan established the Rogers Commission to investigate. The findings revealed that Challenger had not been destroyed by an unforeseeable failure, but by years of ignored warnings, flawed decisions, and a dangerous organizational culture. At the same time, NASA's biomedical team, led by former astronaut Dr. Joseph Kerwin, examined the recovered crew cabin and remains. They concluded that while the breakup forces may not have been immediately fatal, the cabin's impact with the Atlantic at roughly 207 miles per hour was unsurvivable. However, because the impact destroyed much of the forensic evidence, investigators could not determine the exact cause or timing of death with complete certainty. One major obstacle was the absence of a cockpit voice recorder or flight data recorder. Unlike commercial airliners, the Space Shuttle carried no black box. Investigators thus had to reconstruct the accident using radar data, launch footage, telemetry, and recovered debris. Engineers eventually recovered about 47% of Challenger's orbiter, painstakingly assembling thousands of fragments like a giant jigsaw puzzle until every clue pointed back to the failed right solid rocket booster field joint. During the televised hearings, physicist Richard Feynman famously demonstrated the problem by placing an O-ring in ice water, showing how cold temperatures robbed the rubber of its ability to seal properly. The Rogers Commission concluded that Challenger's loss stemmed from 3 failures: a flawed booster design, management's decision to launch despite engineering objections, and a culture that had normalized repeated warning signs. The shuttle fleet was grounded for 32 months while NASA redesigned the boosters, strengthened safety oversight, restored pressure suits for launch and landing, and overhauled its decision-making process. Today, much of Challenger's recovered wreckage remains preserved in a sealed former missile silo at Cape Canaveral, rarely seen by the public, but never forgotten. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching. Did you like this video? If you did, please consider liking, dropping a comment, and hitting the subscribe button so that you don't miss out on our new uploads. Also, don't miss this video you see on your screen right now. It's truly unbelievable.